"Mom, I love you. Be home soon." That's the last thing Tracie Hawlett said to her mother. On the night of July 31st, 1999, she and her best friend, J.B. Beasley, had left Dothan, Alabama, heading to a party for J.B.'s 17th birthday. They got lost. At 11:35 p.m., Tracie called home from a payphone outside a convenience store to say they were finally on their way back. Neither of them made it. By the next afternoon, both girls were found in the trunk of JB's car. Investigators had DNA from the scene almost right away. What they didn't have was a name for it. No criminal record to trace it to, nothing in any database. So the case sat. 20 birthdays passed. JB never had another one. And every year, on the same date, two mothers were still waiting for a name. Then, in 2018, a serial killer on the other side of the country was finally caught using something law enforcement had never tried before, tracing DNA not to a person, but to a family. Ozark's police chief watched it happen and thought about a file in his own office. He sent that 20-year-old sample out for testing. The name that came back was one he already knew. The man they'd been looking for wasn't hiding. He was standing in front of a congregation every Sunday. Before we go any further, a warning. This case involves the murder and sexual assault of two teenagers and contains details some viewers may find disturbing. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. If you're new here, drop a comment and let us know where in the world you're watching from. We read every one. And if you want to see cases like this told in full, subscribing means you won't miss the next. J.B. Beasley was turning 17 that night. Born on the same day, July 31st, 17 years earlier. She was the kind of daughter parents didn't worry about. A member of the Junior Honor Society, a cheerleader, the sort of smart, steady kid who always seemed to know exactly what she wanted out of life and how to go get it. Her mother, Cheryl Bergen, would later describe her simply as a gift. Tracie Hawlett was her best friend, had been since middle school. The kind of friendship where if you saw one of them walking down the street, you could count on the other one being close behind. They weren't just close. They were the kind of inseparable that families joke about, the kind that makes two households feel like one. Dothan, Alabama, was the kind of town where that wasn't unusual at all. A city of around 60,000 people, tucked into the state's southeastern corner near the Florida and Georgia lines, in a region locals call the Wiregrass. The summers there ran hot and humid, the kind of heat that settles in and doesn't lift until well after dark. People knew their neighbors by name. Kids grew up together in the same schools, the same churches, the same backyards, and mostly stayed that way into adulthood. July 31st, 1999, was supposed to be one more ordinary night in a town full of them. A birthday. A party a few miles up the road. Nothing about that evening should have been remembered for any reason other than being a good one. The kind of night two 17-year-olds forget within a year, except for the fact that it happened. Around 10 that night, JB and Tracie left Dothan in JB's black Mazda, heading north toward Headland for the party. A straightforward drive, maybe 10 miles, one they'd made plenty of times before to plenty of other parties. Somewhere along the way, they missed it. A wrong turn at the wrong intersection, easy enough to do on dark rural roads that all start to look the same at night. By the time they realized it, they weren't anywhere close to Headland anymore. They were in Ozark, a town more than 20 miles in the opposite direction, a place neither of them had any particular reason to be. It's the kind of mistake that happens to almost everyone at some point. Most of the time, it costs you 20 minutes and a little embarrassment. You laugh about it later. You tell the story at the party you eventually make it to. For JB and Tracie, that wrong turn put them on a stretch of road in a town they didn't know. After 11 o'clock at night, looking for anyone who could point them back the right way. Just after 11:30, the girls pulled into the Big Little Store, a convenience store and gas station on East Broad Street in Ozark. The store had already closed for the night, but a woman named Marilyn Merritt happened to be there with her daughter, stopping in for a drink before the doors locked. JB and Tracie walked up and asked her for directions back to the highway that would take them home. Merritt gave them clear, simple instructions. She'd remember later that the girls seemed completely fine, a little worried about missing their curfew maybe, but nothing more than that. Their car was clean. Their voices were calm. Two teenagers doing exactly what you'd want a teenager to do when they're lost. Stop, ask, get back on the road. At the payphone by the store's entrance, Tracie called home. Her mother, Carol Roberts, picked up. Tracie told her they'd gotten turned around but had directions now, and they'd be home soon. Before she hung up, she said the words her mother would carry for the next 24 years. "Mom, I love you. Be home soon." Merritt watched from the parking lot as the black Mazda pulled out, turned right toward the highway exactly the way she'd told them, and disappeared into the dark. It was the last time anyone but their killer would ever see them alive. Somewhere in the background of the store's security footage that night, a small white pickup truck sat at the gas pumps. No one bought gas. No one was seen getting in or out. For years, that blurry, unexplained truck would become one of the case's most talked about mysteries, until investigators finally tracked down its owner, cleared him, and closed that particular door for good. The next morning, when neither girl had come home, both families called the police. Around the same time, officers in Ozark found JB's black Mazda sitting on Herring Avenue, less than a mile from the payphone Tracie had used the night before. At first glance, there was nothing alarming about it. No collision damage. No sign the car had been forced off the road. Just a car parked on the side of a quiet street. But the details didn't add up. The car was covered in mud, despite having been washed and fueled the day before. The gas tank was nearly empty. The driver's side window was cracked open a few inches. The doors were unlocked. JB's license sat on the dashboard in plain view, and both girls' purses were still inside. Cash, jewelry, credit cards, all untouched. The car sat there for hours while officers waited on a tow truck, assuming, for most of that time, that they were dealing with an abandoned vehicle and nothing more. It wasn't until early afternoon that an investigator discovered the trunk could be popped from a release lever inside the car, without needing a key. He opened it. Both girls were inside. Each had been shot once in the head. There were no obvious signs of a struggle where they lay. But their shoes and pant legs told a different story. Caked in mud, damp up past the knees, with scratches and briars caught in the fabric. Wherever they'd actually been killed, it wasn't on Herring Avenue. Wherever it was, they'd walked through wet ground and thick brush to get there. This was simply where the car had been left afterward. The scene told investigators plenty on its own. Nothing had been stolen. The cash, the jewelry, the credit cards, all of it left behind exactly where it should have been. Whatever this was, it wasn't a robbery. Robbery didn't explain a single piece of what they were looking at. The initial examination found no obvious signs of sexual assault. But weeks later, the Alabama State Crime Lab came back with something that changed the entire direction of the case. Semen recovered from JB's clothing. Investigators also lifted an unidentified palm print from the inside of the trunk lid. The district attorney overseeing the case said plainly, early on, that this had been a sexual crime, or had at least stemmed from one. Find the person that DNA belonged to, and you'd find the person responsible for everything else that happened that night. That theory turned out to be exactly right. It would just take investigators 20 years to prove it. The answer was sitting in a lab the entire time. It just didn't have a name attached to it yet. That's exactly the kind of case this channel exists for. The ones where the evidence was right there all along, waiting for the right moment, the right technology, or the right person to finally connect it. If that's the kind of story you want to keep seeing, subscribing means you won't miss the next one. A month after the bodies were found, on September 1st, 1999, a local mechanic named Johnny Barentine walked into the police station and said he knew what happened. He was 28, lived less than a mile from where the car had been found, and over 4 recorded hours of questioning, he told 6 different versions of that night. In one, he saw a truck speeding away from the scene. In another, he'd given a stranger a ride. In his final and most detailed account, he claimed a tattooed man had gotten into the girl's car, forced them out on Herring Avenue, and shot them both while Barentine waited nearby, then drove the man home afterward. Police arrested him. For a moment, the entire town exhaled. The case felt closed. It wasn't. Not one version of Barentine's story mentioned anything close to a sexual assault, even though the evidence made clear one had happened. The man he named as the shooter had a solid alibi for the whole night. And when the DNA results came back, they didn't match Barentine, and they didn't match the man he'd accused either. Barentine eventually admitted to a grand jury that he'd made the entire story up, hoping to collect the reward money that had been offered for information. He'd seen nothing. He knew nothing. He was released, and by some accounts, those close to him described him as someone who'd struggled academically his whole life. Someone who may have seen a payout, not a plan, and never thought through what a false confession to a double murder would actually cost him. The case didn't just return to where it started. It was worse than before. Months of resources spent chasing a story that never happened, while the DNA sample that actually mattered sat exactly where it had been the entire time, waiting for a name nobody in that room that day could give it. Barentine wasn't the only name investigators chased down. A man from Michigan had been at a party near Herring Avenue that same night and couldn't account for several hours of his evening. He left town not long after the bodies were found, the kind of detail that raises a flag on its own. Investigators flew out to question him 3 separate times. His DNA didn't match. A man from Mississippi had been staying in Ozark around the time of the murders and disappeared shortly afterward. He was brought in, tested. No match. And then there was the white truck from the store's security footage, the one nobody could immediately place, sitting at the gas pumps the same night the girls were there. It took years, but investigators eventually tracked its owner down, cleared him of any involvement, and closed that door for good. Twice, in fact. The case was re-examined, and the same conclusion reached a second time. Years later, just to be certain. Every lead came back the same way. Cleared. Ruled out. Gone. The DNA sample from JB's clothing remained the one piece of the case that never changed, never got weaker, never stopped mattering. And it still didn't match a single person Alabama's criminal database had on file. Whoever this belonged to had never been arrested for anything, never convicted of anything. There was no record to search, because there was nothing on record to find. The years kept moving even when the case didn't. Dothan changed. New neighborhoods went up. Kids who hadn't even been born in 1999 grew up hearing JB and Tracie's names the way you hear a story passed down. Familiar, but distant. Something that happened before their time. For Carol Roberts and Cheryl Bergen, time never worked that way. Every July 31st came back around exactly the same. The payphone, the last phone call, the car turning right into the dark and never coming home. It didn't fade. It just kept stacking, one anniversary on top of the last, for over 20 years. The case stayed technically open the entire time. The DNA sample sat carefully preserved in a lab, the one constant in a file that otherwise hadn't moved in years. But the technology of 1999 wasn't enough to use it. Neither was 2005. Neither was 2010. The National Criminal Database grew every year, filled with the DNA of people who'd been arrested and convicted. But it only worked if the person responsible was already in it. And he wasn't. He'd never given anyone a reason to be. The case became something close to local legend, mentioned in anniversary write-ups, discussed on true crime forums, brought up every summer when the heat came back and people remembered. Remembering wasn't the same as solving it, though. 20 years passed with no name, no arrest, no answer. Just 2 mothers, growing older, asking the same question every year that nobody could answer. Who did this? The break in this case didn't start in Alabama. It started 3,000 miles away, in California, with an entirely different killer. Because what happened there in April of 2018 is the exact reason Ozark's cold file finally moved again. In April of 2018, nearly 19 years after that night in Ozark, the entire country was watching a different case unfold, 3,000 miles away in California. Joseph James DeAngelo, known for decades only as the Golden State Killer, was finally arrested. He'd murdered at least 13 people and sexually assaulted more than 50 others across the 1970s and 80s, and for over 40 years, he'd simply never been caught. What finally found him wasn't a new witness or a lucky break. It was a technique investigators had never used before in American law enforcement: genetic genealogy. The idea was simple, even if the execution wasn't. Instead of searching a criminal database for the suspect's own DNA, which only works if that person has ever been arrested, investigators ran the crime scene DNA through public genealogy websites. The same platforms millions of ordinary people use to find long-lost relatives. From the partial matches that came back, they built out entire family trees, working outward from distant cousins toward closer relatives, narrowing the field one branch at a time until only one person fit. It didn't search for the killer directly. It searched for his family. And his family led straight to him. Ozark's police chief, Marlos Walker, followed that story more closely than most people in law enforcement did. He had his own reasons. Sitting in his office was a DNA sample that had waited nearly 20 years for exactly this kind of breakthrough, and two mothers who were still waiting for a name. He picked up the phone and called Parabon NanoLabs, the same company that had helped identify DeAngelo, and asked them to do the same thing with the sample from 1999. Parabon ran the DNA through public genealogy databases and came back with a list of Alabama families whose genetic profiles were close enough to matter. Genealogists worked outward from there, building family trees, narrowing branch by branch, the same painstaking process that had cracked the Golden State Killer case months earlier. When the list finally reached Walker's desk, he read through it name by name. Then he stopped. One name on that list wasn't a stranger to him. It was someone he recognized from his own school days, someone he'd grown up around, in the same small stretch of southeast Alabama where this whole case had started and ended without anyone ever leaving. Coley McCraney, 45 years old, born and raised between Dothan and Ozark, a long-haul truck driver, a pastor at a local church, married to a woman named Jeanette, with 2 children of his own. No criminal record, no arrests, nothing that would have ever put his name anywhere near a police file, which was exactly why, for 20 years, it never had. In the community, McCraney wasn't just unremarkable, he was respected. A familiar face at church every Sunday, a man neighbors felt comfortable talking to in their own front yards, someone whose congregation looked up to him. If you'd asked anyone in Dothan or Ozark about Coley McCraney before that day, you wouldn't have heard a single bad word. That was exactly the problem. It was exactly why his DNA had never once needed to be in any database, and exactly why, for 2 decades, nobody had ever thought to look at him twice. A name from a family tree wasn't proof of anything. To know for certain, investigators needed McCraney's actual DNA, and they needed it without giving him any reason to think he was a suspect. Walker understood exactly how fragile that moment was. Treat McCraney like a suspect too early, and he could refuse, call a lawyer, disappear. So instead, Walker approached it differently. He reached out to McCraney directly, not as an investigator closing in, but as someone he'd known since high school, asking for a favor. He told him plainly, "You're not a suspect, but I need your DNA to help rule people out and find who we're actually looking for." McCraney's wife, Jeanette, was there when that conversation happened. She had no reason to doubt any of it, and she encouraged her husband to cooperate, to help however he could. McCraney agreed. He sat calmly while an officer swabbed the inside of his cheek, giving up the one piece of evidence that would end 20 years of silence. without any idea that the family tree built from his own relatives had already led investigators to his door before he ever walked into that room. The results came back clear. No ambiguity, no room for doubt. Coley McCraney's DNA matched the semen sample recovered from J.B. Beasley's clothing on August 1st, 1999. The same sample that had sat in a lab, waiting, for almost 20 years. When investigators confronted him with it, McCraney denied everything. He said he didn't know J.B. Beasley or Tracie Hawlett. He said he'd never even been in Ozark on the night of July 31st. On March 15, 2019, 19 years, 7 months, and 2 weeks after the girls pulled out of that parking lot and disappeared into the dark, Coley McCraney was arrested on multiple counts of capital murder and rape. Prosecutors announced they'd be seeking the death penalty. The shock that followed wasn't just that the case had finally been solved after 2 decades, or that a piece of technology had done what traditional investigation never could. The shock was the name itself. A pastor, a father, a truck driver half the town recognized on sight, someone people had nodded to on the road or sat near in a pew, without a single one of them ever imagining he was the reason 2 families had spent 20 years without an answer. Carol Roberts heard the news of the arrest and, for several minutes, couldn't speak at all. Cheryl Burgon cried. Both women had waited 2 decades for this exact moment, and now that it had finally come, there was no relief in it yet. Just old grief resurfacing, and a new question: would a trial actually give them what they'd been waiting for? The trial was supposed to start in 2020. The pandemic delayed it 4 years. It finally opened in April 2023 in Dale County, 24 years after that night on Herring Avenue. Coley McCraney, now 49, sat at the defense table facing 4 counts of capital murder and 1 count of rape. Over 8 days, the prosecution built its case, witness by witness. And then McCraney did something few defendants ever choose to do. He took the stand himself, opening himself up to direct cross-examination, with nothing standing between him and the questions coming. His story had changed completely from the flat denial he'd given back in 2019. Now, he said he'd met JB at a mall in Dothan months before the murders, that she'd introduced herself as Jennifer, that they'd exchanged numbers and stayed in touch. He claimed his truck broke down that night near the store, that the girls happened to see him and offered him a ride, and that what happened between them in his truck cab was consensual. Afterward, he said, they drove him home and he never saw them again. The prosecution took that story apart piece by piece. There was no phone record, no witness, nothing to support any prior relationship between McCraney and J.B. Beasley. Marilyn Merritt testified plainly that the girls had been lost, looking for directions, nothing more. Tracie's own phone call to her mother, captured in real time, minutes before they vanished, confirmed they were heading straight home, not toward any meeting. Under cross-examination, McCraney admitted something that undercut his entire defense on its own. He'd never told a single person, at any point over the following 20 years, that he'd known J.B. Beasley at all. On April 26, 2023, after 8 days of testimony, the jury returned its verdict, guilty on all 4 counts. Under Alabama law, using a victim's vehicle in the commission of a crime elevates the charge to capital murder, which meant McCraney was now facing the possibility of the death penalty. The next day, the jury reconvened to decide his sentence. They came back with life in prison without the possibility of parole. It wasn't the outcome prosecutors had originally sought, but it meant Coley McCraney, 49 years old, would never walk out of a prison gate again for the rest of his life. In the courtroom, when the verdict was first read, Carol Roberts was silent for several minutes before she could speak at all. She later said simply, they'd waited 24 years, and finally, someone was being held accountable. Cheryl Burgon described the moment the word guilty was read aloud. She leaned forward in her seat, and the tears she'd been holding back for over 2 decades finally came all at once. Alabama Attorney General Steve Marshall, who personally prosecuted the case, stood before reporters after the sentencing and said what everyone in that courtroom already understood. They'd lost two girls who never got the chance to grow up, to live the lives that were taken from them that night. He was honest about something else, too, that no verdict, however final, could bring complete closure. Not after 24 years. Not after everything both families had already lost, long before this case ever reached a courtroom. What the verdict could do was answer the one question that had followed Carol Roberts and Cheryl Bergen through every one of those years. Coley McCraney is now serving his sentence at a correctional facility in Alabama. In a phone interview from prison, he continued to maintain his innocence, telling a reporter people could call him a cheater, an adulterer, whatever they wanted, but that he hadn't killed anyone. The DNA said otherwise. So did a jury. For 20 years, investigators chased down every lead that came through the door. A false confession, a truck that led nowhere, men flown in from other states, tested and cleared. Every single one of those leads went somewhere, just never toward the truth. The truth was never hiding. It was standing in a pulpit every Sunday, shaking hands after service, raising two kids, married to a woman who had no reason in the world to doubt him. What finally cracked this case wasn't a tip, or a confession, or a mistake McCraney made 20 years too late. It was a piece of technology, built to trace not a person, but a family. The same technology that caught the Golden State Killer 3,000 miles away, reaching back into a small Alabama town and finding exactly what 2 decades of traditional investigation never could. J.B. Beasley and Tracie Hawlett never got to grow up. But after 24 years, their mothers finally got the one thing they'd been asking for since that July night in 1999: a name. If you want to see the next case where science finally reaches back far enough to answer a question everyone had given up on, that's exactly what this channel covers. Subscribe, and you'll be here for it. This has been Unresolved Case.